Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in their Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Today's episode will be the fifth in a mini-series that grew out of what we thought would be a single episode. I felt the need to re-examine the issue of fine-tuning, but wanted to avoid any talk of examples that are too often thrown out there. Examples that some people think point to fine-tuning of the universe for life. Examples like our sun producing the exact wavelengths of light that are optimal for plant growth, or astrophysical details like the tilt of Earth's rotational axis, its distance from the sun, the presence of Jupiter and Saturn, the position of our solar system in the galaxy, and a long list of other details and claims. For me, these are not examples of the universe being fine-tuned for life. Instead, they're fine-tuning of life for the universe it finds itself in. But in doing our research on fine-tuning of the universe, while doing our best to flag and set aside arguments related to the fine-tuning for life, we realized that we were throwing away too much important material, that there was an angle in this story in which the universe was fine-tuned for life. We learned that there's a difference between the fine-tuning to produce life and fine-tuning to sustain life, especially sustaining life on Earth. So we decided to include an additional episode that focused on how the universe is so fine-tuned to produce life. And to make sure we weren't still being too selective in the data we were paying attention to, we expanded that to two additional episodes, one in which we talked to an expert with a Christian worldview and another one with an expert having an atheist worldview. And both convinced me, at least, that yes, the universe is so very fine-tuned to produce a wide range of different atomic elements. A diverse periodic table that features dozens and dozens of different kinds of atoms. Not just a few small ones like carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, but bigger ones like sodium, potassium, calcium, iron, copper, selenium. All of these being essential for life, especially complex, intelligent life. Today and next week, we're going to focus on the fact that life seemed to have been baked right into the underlying structure of the Big Bang. That as soon as the universe had produced a platform or a stage for life to appear on, in the blink of an eye, life just popped into view and took off. Everyone is quick to emphasize that this is all based on a single observation, what scientists will refer to as an n=1 observation. That single observation being life on Earth. We don't know if what we're learning about the origin of life on Earth is representative of other planets orbiting the habitable zone of other stars. This is what's behind the famous Drake equation that we'll be talking about later in this episode. But now let's get into the episode. Let's introduce the guest we're bringing in for this conversation. Today we'll be talking to Dr. Stephen Freeland, who was our guest a few years ago in episode number 66. Dr. Freeland studied at Oxford, at York and Cambridge universities, did his postdoc at Princeton University, and spent 4 years as project manager for NASA's Astrobiology Institute, leading a team of astrophysicists, astrochemists, and astrobiologists, all focusing their efforts on trying to understand the origin of life. He's now at the University of Maryland as a director of interdisciplinary studies and doing his own research, but is still involved with that NASA team. And we have him right here in our studio. Dr. Freeland, Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
We gave a more detailed introduction in episode number 66, which we won't repeat here, and we'll have links in our show notes to his personal website and faculty website. But I do want to emphasize that you've led this interdisciplinary team at NASA.
Well, so that finished in 2013, and I would say that then the relevant narrative for the intervening years is to say just been involved repeatedly in setting up teams across scientific disciplines, usually around the origin of life. And I've been doing that just again and again, but no one of them was obviously big enough to call out the way you call out 4 years at NASA, right?
Stephen, what's it like to lead a NASA group of astrobiologists and astrophysicists?
You always start with the hardest questions, right? I'd have to think a month on that. The gut response, and I think there's some truth in it, is to say it's a lesson in humility, isn't it? They're all better at what they do than what I am. So it's learning how to be a civil servant, which I think is the key to administration anywhere in a university, is think of yourself like a civil servant. It's not about you. It should never be about you. It should be about them. And it's promoting them and helping them work together is what you try and do.
It's got to be a lot of fun. Always surprises. Oh, yeah. Can never predict anything.
You know what I love most? And it's almost like the Big Bang Theory. It's the collision within a single day of the most incredibly rarefied clever stuff that they're doing with the most minutiae, mundane, they missed a flight and they're angry at you or something. But it's just the collision of real people with this stuff is real fun. Yes. Right.
Okay. And do you mind giving our listeners a brief thumbnail sketch of your belief system? You strongly identify with a Christian faith, I know.
I do. I do. I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole. I just want to be honest and say that I have been unchurched really since COVID. But I think I've been working that through with God in prayerfulness. And I know it sounds dreadfully heterodox, but I feel that one of the most shocking things God's telling me is it's okay. It's a phase I'm going through, and God's there with me. But most importantly, yes, still identify with the Christian faith utterly.
Do you want to comment on the tradition, the strand of Christian faith that you were formed in and where you stand now?
Yeah. I would say that if one plotted like a scientist, a sort of, plotted a line through the dots, gradually drifting higher and higher church, and probably when I do go back, it'll be something like Greek Orthodox, I think.
Okay.
Right. Most recently seen as sort of higher church Anglican, but no problem with the supernatural or the charismatic faith. It's just not my place of worship, right?
I'm just kind of curious, what do you find attractive about the higher or for example, orthodoxy? What attracts you?
I think it's funny when I talk to you, you give me epiphanies in the process of answering your questions.
Yeah,
Right? But I think it was
okay.
suddenly clear to me that what it is this prayerfulness since COVID is the silent tradition. I think I grew up talking too much, and I'm learning to be quiet. And I think the reflection, the introspection, and the discovery of God within, as well as God without, I love. Yeah.
Yeah, I read a book by Alistair McGrath a number of years ago called, I think it was called Spirituality or Christian Spirituality, where he's kind of lamenting the lack of kind of a spirituality within the evangelical world.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and he was arguing for an appreciation of, for example, Eastern Orthodoxy and other what we would call higher, I guess, traditions because of that lack. And certainly your experience is not unique.
Thank you.
Well,
No, that really is affirming and helpful. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, I've read quite a number of fairly high-profile people over the last number of years that have gravitated in that direction for the same reasons. So it's really interesting to hear you say that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And I would say the external in this unchurched world has very much been in nature. And that sounds dreadfully worrying to some strains of evangelical Christianity. But my sort of very simplistic counter-argument is that was true for many early Christians who were wandering out through the woods to try and find people to talk to, right?
Yeah.
So, it's sort of, it's not to say that it's all locating God within. It's finding God within, but very much finding God without. But finding God outside of church. Forgive me, we're on a digression, but I promise to end it here for my part. Yancey, what was it? Finding God in Unexpected Places. That feels like a book that has spoken to me over the years. And part of what it's saying to me right now is it's okay. This is, for whatever reason, this is okay right now. Yeah. Thank you, though. And just for the sake of completeness, I should also say that one of the things that has been humbling, and I think is directly the way that my spirituality works from God, the number of conversations that take place in this office at a state university where we don't, but people who know that I'm a Christian and come in and talk to me, share what they're thinking, proves to me that church is not to be measured by four walls, right? I mean, we all know that, but yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Stephen, we've really been looking forward to getting your perspective on this. Over the past 4 episodes, we've been talking to guests about the Big Bang, how it seemed to produce this incredibly fine-tuned universe that just out of that we get all these building blocks that could be assembled into an array of different kinds of atoms, the periodic table, and those could then be put together into complex molecules, and eventually those became, well, the stars and the planets. And again, we heard from 4 experts, 2 of them career astrophysicists, and one of those being an atheist, who all insist that all of this required incredible fine-tuning. And here's where you come in. That whole process took a bit less than 10 billion years for all the particles and atoms produced in that whole process to come together and make Earth, our home planet, 4.3 billion years ago. What the TV network NBC refers to as the third rock from the sun. I think they stole that phrase from Jimi Hendrix. He wrote the song Third Stone from the Sun before NBC plagiarized that. But again, 10 billion years until we get just the platform for life to appear. And then, in a cosmic blink of an eye, just over 500 million years, 1/20th the amount of time it takes to build a planet, all of a sudden there's enough life on the planet that it leaves fossil evidence of its existence. Living organisms with a genetic code and all kinds of microscopic nanomachines, again, in the metaphorical blink of an eye. So it's as if life just had to appear. It was ready to go, like it was a cosmic imperative that living organisms are inevitable. Or maybe it was planted here. Maybe. Stephen, why don't you tell us about that cosmic imperative?
Hmm. I mean, that was a beautiful summary, and I agree with every word of what you said, including and up to maybe it was planted here. That I think that's what's so exciting about Origins research in the last 20 years. The story is when you sort of consider how readily life formed from non-life. That much is clear. We're always dealing with a sample size of one so far, hence the drive to, it's just scientifically, to find life elsewhere. There are 100 reasons, but one of them is like, if it's the same story twice or three times, you're like, that's a pattern. But it's okay to draw inference from a sample size of one, and it's just the way you've said it. I do think it's under-recognized, even by those who know the facts, because a lot of those who know the facts don't quite know the context for why that's so weird. From a perspective of molecular evolution, all the basics were in place in that eye blink. And then it's
Yeah.
just been diversification ever since. And very, very, very recently, in an eye blink of an eye blink, this weird adventure called multicellularity, right? But
Right.
yeah, so it's like everything happened in an eye blink, and then it just beautifully diversified.
Hmm.
Now, now, Stephen, you said that was we have an N of one, a sample size
Yeah,
of one.
yeah,
You were
yeah.
obviously referring to life on Earth, but I thought in the news it was just sometime this week on Mars. They also had evidence of what could be fossil evidence in the rock on Mars, just like we have these fossil evidence of life on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit that I heard that from a colleague, and I haven't checked it for myself yet. But I also want to tell you, yeah, but that's almost every year. Everything we're finding as we explore is more lifiness wherever we're
Hmm.
looking
Okay.
around there, particularly Mars. It fits the narrative, is all I'd say. It definitely takes this idea that we're not just inferring from a data point of one, but it's not life on Mars, and it's just endless gentle drift in the direction. I mean, we know, sorry, slight digression, but let's be quite clear here. Mars was born very similar to Earth. They've since geologically evolved very differently. But,
Right.
in that exact interval, that eye blink you were talking about, our nearest neighbor planet that had a warm liquid ocean and the same atmosphere, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it would seem that it's not surprising that it's very lifey the more we look at it. And I think one of the overriding themes I like to talk about when we focus on the sort of the extraterrestrial investigation angle is how little we've done. The usual counter narrative is what a waste of money. People are starving, all of that, I get it. But you don't understand how little we've actually done.
Hmm.
We've
Right.
done 3 life detection experiments on Mars in 1977. That's it, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah, the more we're looking, the things that you're describing about are simultaneously very exciting and a long way from life or answering questions definitively. Yeah.
Right. And what would the conditions have been like on Earth at the time that life first formed? And maybe since we're talking about Mars, was Mars like that at that time too?
Yeah, I mean, look, to be fair, you probably would want a trained geophysicist, although these days many of them are sort of reborn, birthed themselves as planetary scientists, because this is a fast-moving area. The instrumentation, the technology, the science is moving really fast to ever sort of new understandings of the precise details. But I think one of the things I'd encourage for this podcast and us talking together now is to say, don't get lost in that forest. Look at the forest, not the trees. Because even within a very detailed, sometime of the future geological rendition of 4.3 billion year old Earth, you've then got the question of microenvironments, right? Which could change everything. So, really, I think this is why I agree with you. Timing is the big thing that we should be focused on right now with certainty. It was an eye blink, right? And
Yeah.
it's sort of that's what's incredible is that it happened there. And the narrative for it being a highly unlikely event and we just got lucky is looking so weak with every new finding, right? It
So,
could be, but yeah,
yeah.
sorry, Scott, you take
No,
over.
no,
Yeah.
no, just a quick question on that. I just read an article recently, and I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but it was kind of the headline with the idea that the Drake equation has been dealt a pretty nasty blow because they've determined that actually plate tectonics play a very
Hmm.
significant role in the formation. Without plate tectonics, we probably wouldn't have any, and that just even narrows it more. And they're saying that when they ran the statistics, when they ran the numbers on some supercomputer, I guess, for the Drake equation, given the issue of plate tectonics, it wasn't a good result. It looked like the likelihood, in fact, is extremely low. So I'm just
Extremely
curious
low.
if you Yeah.
I mean, this is
Have
the
you heard of
yin and the
this?
yang of it, right? That is
Yeah.
possible. Haven't seen the exact article you've said, but I do want to be
Okay.
clear about some context there. What's stunning about the Drake equation is that every other term is way more life-friendly than we dared imagine 50 years ago.
Can you just for the moment explain what
Yeah.
the Drake equation
Yeah,
is?
Scott, do you want to take that away? Well, yep.
Oh, well, you'd be far better. Well, basically, that the Drake equation is just with the amount of galaxies and planets and so on and so forth, statistically, and especially after they've discovered these exoplanets and so on, that it's a pretty high likelihood that life occurred somewhere else. Am I getting that right? You better,
No, I think that's fine. I think what I would add, and maybe it's just my bias, is a little bit of context for why did Drake come up with this thing? Or, so he was leading a workshop near to Virginia to talk about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. So it's the way that we often sort of begin it with teaching is it's not an equation in the way of something to be solved or to give you an answer. It's a device for framing a conversation. And what he did was just break up what are the factors involved. I would say that from this, because this was in what I used to have it memorized well, but I want to say 60s. Um, I would say that from the vantage point of 2024, it's very much an exercise in how an astrophysicist sees the world. I'm not sure I'd write out an equation that way, but it works. And that's how, if you are an astrophysicist, how many stars are there? How many of them have planets? How many of those planets are capable of supporting of life? On how many of those planets does life actually evolve? And then two or three more terms. There's just ways to have different conversations that add up to the big picture, right?
right.
And so, really, you're talking about the habitability one, which has really been the hot one for the last 25 years. How many of these planets are capable of supporting life? And so, the news would be that there is growing evidence that plate tectonics is deeply enmeshed in our planet's ability to sustain life. I would add a counter argument that there are other voices, even more avant garde, suggesting that life plays a very important role in sustaining plate tectonics.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
So,
Interesting.
a long way from resolved. But what I was then countering with is to say what's really interesting is that when Drake formed that equation, we didn't know a single exoplanet. Now we think there's an average of more than one per star. And if you plug in Luke's bit about like if it's capable of supporting life, what's the likelihood of life actually happening? Our one data point says very likely. And I struggle for a metaphor, but it's as if you're walking, I don't know, into a room you've never been in your life before, and there's a dartboard, and there's one dart, and it's in the middle of the bullseye. You don't want to overinterpret it, but it doesn't look like an accident, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, would this be predicated on the idea that given the right conditions, life would somehow arise out of non-life, or the other thing is the idea of panspermia, right? That life
Right,
is
right,
kind
right.
of right.
It came from
So
elsewhere. Yeah.
yeah, so it sounds like what you're more or less arguing is that the conditions for life are fairly common, and therefore it's more likely that life, in fact, if you have those conditions, life will out.
I think so. But I think it's a fair dichotomy. It sounds outrageous to talk panspermia, but I have to say that over the years, as well as a number of rather interesting characters, a lot of the best origins minds have had said we've got to consider that possibly. So I'll say one really damaging thing for all the, conspiracy alien theorists out there, but then we'll move back to what you said, because that's where I would land. If we learned through astrophysics next week that Earth was doomed with an event we could not stop, supernova happening next door, we've just realized it's going to happen next year, no time for us to get ourselves out, do you think that even our sentient species might send life out and say, well, life will go on? And is it that outrageous to think that that might have happened before, given there were 10 billion years before we ever got here? And I don't think that's the most logical one. I just think it's not entirely sensible to say, well, that's ridiculous. We won't talk about it. But let's go to the other option, which is the one that I tend to favor, really is just motivation rather than a science, right? What is the motivation to do my science? Is a vision that life flows forth unstoppably from the non-living universe. Because I find that so excitingly different from the vision that I was raised with in the 20th century, typified by everyone from Douglas Adams to Carl Sagan, pale blue dot, we're lost in the backwaters of the unfashionable end of the Milky Way galaxy, and it just got lucky. None of the data fit that. And in fact, if I can offer one more rejoinder on plate tectonics, yeah, it's amazing that we're learning not just to see exoplanets, but even to perhaps get some idea of whether they have plate tectonics. But we're not very good at that yet. It's way too premature to say how common that is in the universe by my understanding. And I really apologize if anyone listening knows better than I do. But my understanding is, once again, that we only know of plate tectonics here. There was an argument for a while about Mars. And I think the consensus view now is it never had it, but for a while the view was at least out there that it started there and it kind of ground to a halt. And it's
Hmm.
one of the lines of evidence that had people thinking about whether life on Earth actually sustains plate tectonics. But here's the point. Once you get beyond Earth, we don't know that much.
Yeah.
And I would argue that, and in fact, my good friend Brittany Schmidt would argue that Europa has functional plate tectonics. They're just all different because it's all done with ice sheets, right? Ice flow to the surface, they fracture, they flow over each other, they
Yeah.
subvert. There's a cycling is what matters.
Right.
And I think we don't know enough to say that that's really rare and it kills the Drake equation, particularly when everything else in the Drake equation we have learned is going the other direction. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Luke, you were.
Uh,
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify, Europa is one of the moons of Jupiter.
Yeah, good Lord. You're catching me late in the afternoon. I should,
Jupiter.
yeah, just checking. It is Jupiter. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Jupiter. Yeah.
Okay,
And one of our favorite spots to say that would be a likely place to find life.
Right.
And it would be lovely to live
right.
there. Yeah.
So let's talk about conditions. We were talking about conditions. I wondered what Earth was like back 4 billion years and compared to what it is now, and whether those conditions was what life first formed
Yeah.
under.
So, I mean, this is the $1 million question, actually, more accurately, the tens of $1 million question that drives the geophysicist to ever more refined models, because that's rather an important question, isn't it? And this is where I do just again caution, yeah, but what about microenvironments? What if we made a global if you described Earth today, it would be accurate at a scale at which you're thinking, not at the scale at which I'm looking at it, right? I'm looking at a concrete brief block. That wouldn't be an accurate description of Earth today. So that's quite independent of understanding what Earth was. We shouldn't get too hung up on details there, I think, because I don't know how to get out of that rabbit hole. What we perhaps a slightly different way of answering the question is say, what do we feel confident about? No free oxygen. We'd be very surprised at
Right.
that. Oxygen was all bound up in rocks. I think it's still accurate to say no land. Land is actually formed by volcanism, ultimately, right? And then plate tectonics, right? But at first we were a water world with no oxygen. And so really, this is the big news, is sort of a very simple level, not that different from Darwin's warm little pond, except the whole thing was one big pond, or the primordial soup. None of these ideas are really revolutionary and new, but that's what we know for certain, right? And I do think the geophysicists are telling us with greater confidence that there were fewer minerals by a lot. And then after that, we sort of get into details where they're absolutely true, but at the same time, they might not be true of that weird hydrothermal vent in that corner of the planet at that point.
Tell us about the hydro vents because we did mention in our introductory episode about black smokers. So maybe tell us about
Yeah,
that.
so they have, I mean, these days it's only fair to say they have long been favored as a very interesting option for where life begins. Now, honestly, I'm going to be very frustrating to you because in a number of ways, I refuse to get drawn into these classical debates other than exactly what you are fairly asking me. Oh, yeah, that's a thing, that it began in hydrothermal vents. There are a bunch of people believe that. It makes a lot of sense to me. I feel much more confident with the idea that the origin of life absolutely required a flow of energy. And a hydrothermal vent is one great example of that, right? I think another thing that if I can, so this is the weird abstract level at which I function for research, is to think about the abstract truths, not the microenvironments. That it absolutely requires energy flowing down an entropy hill to drive it, because everything does. Yeah, maybe we could proceed. I think it is very interesting that it used the most abundant chemicals that are made by astrophysics. But I have a slightly backwards view on the anthropic principle. I think what's fascinating is if there is an imperative towards life, what we find is it's such an imperative, it finds the shortest, easiest route with the most abundant stuff. Therefore, it's less interesting to me the universe produces carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen in than it is that life is an unstoppable mandate of the physical universe. It just you get the conditions right and boom, it happens using the most abundant stuff. It doesn't need to wait for rare elements or unusual conditions from what we know, right?
Right. So those are the building blocks, the elements, and you also made reference to the flow of energy.
Yeah.
Tell us about this flow of energy because I think you're obviously referring to heat, but there's a couple other forms.
Yeah, and I'm not
Uh,
trained enough as a physicist to navigate this with all the sophistication it deserves, but I'll do my best. Yeah, there's much more than heat. It's just energy flows, right? I think it's one of the areas in flux right now is how well do we understand concepts of entropy and will they be replaced by more sophisticated paradigms, the way that relativity replaced Einsteinian physics, right? That's a very hot area right now. But what I really would just want to talk about is the idea that it's not magic, that there is any energy is everywhere. I think it was
right.
a sort of a paradigm shift in my head to sort of really notice Earth is constantly receiving energy and giving off energy. Everything in the universe is an open system, is what we would talk about. So it's not that that's a rare thing. It's just that that is absolutely the sort of, if I mix my metaphors, that is the river that drives the water wheel of producing molecules, right? Is the flow of energy.
Right.
And maybe I should focus there more on the chemistry and say, look, what is interesting is how simple those molecular arrangements are. You've talked about the atoms, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, maybe, and phosphorus, right? And hydrogen, left that out. 6 are really what you need for life. With the exception of phosphorus, they are the most abundant ones that are produced by nuclear fusion. That's what life has been able to construct itself with. But even to non-chemists, there are chemicals that that are one step beyond those elements. Water is 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, H2O. Carbon dioxide is carbon and 2 oxygens, CO2. You only have to go one step next, and you're starting to get the building blocks of life. To be accurate, I should say you go one more step and you'll get things like methane and ammonia. But that was what Stanley Miller put into the spark tubes and got amino acids out of. The chain is continuous.
Right.
And I'm less obsessed with the atoms than I am with how continuous and flawless and seamless and quick that chain got going, right?
Right. But Stephen, where I was going with these energy flows, I said obviously you're referring to temperature at these hydrothermal vents. There's a difference of hundreds of degrees Celsius, even if you just move a few centimeters, as I understand it. But then there's also a tremendous pH gradient, an acidity gradient of, again, it's a huge acidity gradient just within a few centimeters. And then I also understand there's a lot of electricity being generated down there. I saw it in the news just a few days ago. They're finding these little nuggets, little rocks on the bottom, the deep Pacific.
Giving off free oxygen just to blow that one. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So you've got this electrical gradient, a pH gradient, and an acidity gradient, and a temperature gradient. These are all the forms of energy that the cells can use.
No, you're so right. And that's one of the things that makes them very attractive candidates. It's only fair to your readers to say, let's be very clear that as of talking to you today, August 6th, 2024, there is nothing close to a consensus view on the mechanism, the route by which life emerged. And we can come back to that if you want. But that's sort of one of the things that makes me sort of pause here to say all the things a cell needs. What they are is just really attractive examples of what happens everywhere that is what you would need to get life going, right?
Yeah, right. So it must be very challenging then for those who are looking for life on other planets, when we really don't understand in detail, at least, how life comes about, even here. How do we then go and figure out how it might have come about? I'm just saying it must present quite a challenge, because it's not like we have a
yes and no.
Okay.
On one level, what you said, absolutely, just the way you said it. But another level, think what we just said. Life got started geologically instantly using the most abundant stuff in an environment that happens everywhere.
Right.
That tells us a lot about what we're looking for. Not saying we can rule out what they call exotic life, chemically exotic life.
Right.
It might be out there based on, I don't know, deuterium or something. But the lion's share of money at this point should be looking for water-based life with carbon, because it's everywhere. It's everything from the conditions to the components. We kind of have a surprisingly good idea of what we're looking for, oddly. And it may be one of our best things is finding that and looking for it and then finding it to teach us about the mechanism, because then we'd have a couple of things to sort of compare with each other and say, here's the other thing. The problem with very important to say this, the problem with not having a consensus on the origin of life is not a lack of ideas, it's an overabundance of ideas and a lack of discrimination. What we don't need is more people hypothesizing about it. What we need is another example, so we can be like, well, that narrows it down to only these ones that are possible now, right?
So speaking of that, then the Miller experiments you mentioned, has there been an ongoing effort to create life in the lab? And how is that panning out? Like
I mean, I'd say that, like so much, it has diversified until what you've just said is now an umbrella for a large swathe of scientists around the world in different disciplines. Okay. So Miller, seriously, in the 60s, we might just have been at a place in our minds where we were trying to produce life in a test tube. But I think even Miller, if asked, would have said, no, I was trying to see if I could get amino acids, which is what he got, which are building blocks of life. But that shocked the world enough that there's been an entire cottage industry that spun off just trying to make organics, but other endless spin-offs of trying to make life in the lab, including latterly coming from a completely different direction, synthetic biology, genetic engineering on steroids, which is going deeper and more chemical in re-engineering and saying, let's just make life anew, right? So all of that is sort of crowding into this wonderful space where ideas are jostling. And
Wow.
again, there's a preponderance of ideas. There are a couple of blocks we can talk about that are the puzzles, but there is a preponderance of ideas that are possible for a lot of it. And the real question now is discriminating between them. Yeah,
I'd like to jump in again. I'm going to come
please.
back to this energy flow because I think there's an important detail here. We're swirling with all these different ideas, as you were saying, Stephen. There's a
Right.
preponderance of different ideas. But I was mentioning how at those black smokers, those hydrothermal vents, you've got this massive pH acidity gradient
Yeah.
and the electrical gradient. There is electrical charge building up on the rocks down there, having to do, I guess, with these inorganic metals that they're down there,
Yeah.
iron and that sort of thing. And here's the point. We're going to jump ahead in our discussion as we understand life forms now, the kind of cells that make our bodies, they have a little energy factory inside of them, these mitochondria, which biologists will say these mitochondria arose from one cell swallowing up another
Yeah.
cell. And so that second cell that was swallowed up becomes a little energy factory
Yeah.
that makes chemical energy. And here's where I'm going. That mitochondrion, that thing that makes the chemical energy, it does that by setting up a pH gradient using inorganic metals that then
Yeah.
generate an electrical gradient. So that little mitochondria recapitulates that whole hydrothermal vent scenario.
Absolutely. And by the way, the hydrothermal vent people, and we are sort of like tribes with our, how I belong, right? I think one of their key claims, and it is a fascinating one, is how much of life is mimicked in non-life if you look in the right place and the right hydrothermal vent. And I think, a quick note of caution, we shouldn't talk about hydrothermal vents like they're one thing. And well done for talking about black smokers, they're one type. But even within a given black smoker, like people, that one's got a long finger, right? This one has an area where the gradient is. So there's endless variety there, right?
Right.
But yes, the recapitulation is a fascinating facet. I think at my more perverse moments, I think that to me, it's sort of like reversing the anthropic principle. It more speaks to the idea that what life is doing is an unstoppable universal process of energy flow in the universe. And you can find it in living forms and non-living forms. And life is just it. So I tend to look at it that way rather than the way that perhaps most hydrothermal vent people look at it, which is to say, really eerie coincidence, and this is where it emerged from. It might have done. But I think what we're really looking at is that life can be understood as physics and it all fits. I've never understood the creationist or ID argument that life defies entropy. It doesn't. Evolution doesn't defy entropy. It's always seemed to be a peculiarly shallow argument. Just its stubbornness to listen to what the obvious answer is. But I think that's wrapped up in this, that the universe is behaving according to entropy, but so is the origin of life, and so is its subsequent evolution. And I think where we're getting to is sort of close, inching our way closer to being able to put it all together. So a lot of what's going on is can the biologists understand the physicists? Can the physicists understand the chemists? Because we've all got these hypotheses, but I think we're all groping towards the same thing. And it is this sort of universal flowing of energy, how that manifests through chemistry into what we recognize as biology.
You had mentioned earlier astrobiology is very tribal. You said there's these different tribes. I think you're referring in part to the fact that there's a lot of disagreement as to what needed to happen first, or maybe it all somehow three very important things had to happen at the same time. So you've got some astrobiologists saying that you first needed a genetic code and reproduction, that had to come first. Some would say, no, we had to have metabolism and energy production, that whole
Right.
pH gradient and that sort of thing. And then others saying, no, you first needed to have membranes that would contain the whole
Yeah.
package. So tell us more about that
Yeah.
tribalism.
I've been trying to write an article. I'm so overdue on it, but capturing for an encyclopedia the origin of life, state of the field. Can you send me a transcript of what you just said? Because there's that, right? And when you think about it, there's something called the central dogma of molecular biology
Right.
that basically, I'm cheating a bit here, but I'd say defines life in terms of those three components. So logically, each one has its advocates as having to come first. I wanted to say two very minor corrections that seem pedantic, but I hope I can build to a bigger point. Not astrobiology is tribal. Astrobiology has, in my experience, been one of the most welcoming, friendly, non-tribal communities out there. And that's one of the reasons why I proudly self-identify with them. I just find people from all disciplines enjoying each other. It's origins that's quite tribal. And origins is a subset of astrobiology. Astrobiology is placing life into an understanding of the universe. Stop treating it like biology and physics are different things, right? Biology occurs on planets in front of stars, as far as we know. We need a so that's astrobiology, and it includes origins, but it includes so much more. Now, the second point where I hope to make something slightly more substantive out of this is to say, I think that tribalism was how Origins was. And if there's one thing I praise the emerging generation of early career scientists, and at this point, I mean young professors, not grads, it's that they're much less tribal and that many of the barriers seem to be falling because they're not. It was which one of the three is it? They're like maybe a bit of all three, or I would tend to the view none of them, and all of them are products of evolution. And that's the sort of weird space that we're moving into, where physics and chemistry and evolution have to sort of find a new language for where they all meet, right?
Why in particular do you think that Origins is a more tribal discipline, or has been a more tribal discipline?
I think honestly, because it is one of the archetypal, like what I mean by that, one of the more ancient examples we have of true, simple, interdisciplinary questions in science. There's a chemistry view on it, there's a physics view on it, and there's a biology view on it. And you've got three tribes to start with there. And then you
Yeah.
ask anybody in any of those departments, how does your department break up into tribes? And they won't question you. They'll be like, oh, it's this and versus this, right? So it just naturally, it's the coming together of everybody around the question, makes it tribal, right? And I think, like, if I can just say this, a horrible generalization, but like the younger generation have perhaps challenged our dogged adherence to denominations, for example, it just doesn't gel with postmodernists to say, well, yeah, I've got to either be a chemist or a biologist, or I've got to see it their way, or if for me to be right, everyone else has to be wrong. They don't see it that way. And I think that's really healthy. Sorry, back to you, Luke. Right.
Well, I was going to say the other reason why I think it's so tribal. I mean, a lot of non-experts will ask this question. You need enzymes to create all these energies and these forms of,
Do
assembling
you,
the
Luke?
carbon, hydrogen. So you need enzymes to do that, proteins, but to get those, you need a genetic machinery. And before you have any of that, before you have all this synthetic machinery and then the energy production has to happen, you want to contain it within a membrane because otherwise you generate these genes, but the genes just float away. A wave comes and floats it away.
But with
So you
respect,
need
Luke, everything you just put forth there is a beautiful example of us reasoning from the way it is now to what must have been the question then. And that's what I reject.
Hmm.
If you
yeah,
have a component of lipid membranes, protein enzymes, and genetics, then everything you've said is true. And therefore your question follows. If it didn't
right.
begin there, and I think there is growing evidence that all of that evolved out of something else, then I'm not at all sure that any of that follows, right? You don't need enzymes to make complex macromolecules. Minerals do really well. And we're at the very infant steps of finding out any kind of pattern to which mineral does what. But they're in the catalytic converter in your car, Luke. They are
Yeah.
good at that. And this is, to me, even more excitingly and more abstract, the sort of indivisible line between life and non-life in the universe, which is very personal to me. I struggle to persuade people. But that to me is exactly what we should expect from a naturalistic origin of life. Minerals were doing it, and then life learned how to do it, and then evolution took over. And these days it's all done by coded enzymes. That's what I think we're
Okay.
talking about, right?
Hmm.
This is the
Yeah.
metaphor of the stone archway and the scaffolding.
Yes.
Maybe you want to.
Yes. Yeah. Just the idea that you're looking at an arch, how could that possibly be built? Because it sort of defies gravity and it doesn't hold together unless everything's all there. But then you're like, well, they use scaffolding and it's not there anymore. And if so, yes, that for the origin of life. I think whereas an evolutionary biologist, where this is coming from in me, is to say that every component of the central dogma, there is more and more evidence. It looks like the outcome of natural selection. The way that if you see a bird with a tremendously long beak, you think that was natural selection to work with a particular kind of flower. Well, that applies when we look at DNA, when we look at amino acids, when we look at lipids. They're really good at what they do. So why do we think they were the first? Right? Yeah.
So are you, am I right in because I'm the non-scientist in this discussion, so I'm just so for what you're saying, are you arguing for almost a non-life Darwinian process? In other words, that
Yes.
even at the level of non-life, in the level of physics,
Yes.
there's a Darwinian kind of process going on?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think it has various names, and I think it's an idea that is in the process of happening while we're doing this podcast. We don't know what to call it. We don't quite have the language for it. Some would say that's what we've been talking about and calling chemical evolution for a decade. And I'd say yes, but I think it's broader and more general, the way that you've just put it, Scott. And it's back to energy, isn't it? Energy causes, so, if you put oxygen in the presence of carbon, in the presence of energy, it will form carbon dioxide, probably, right? If
Right.
you put a strong, I'm just going to say something idiotic and non-scientific, but same with acid and base, right? Things move on cross gradients. And what life is made out of is sort of the inevitable product of what you do on a gradient, right? And I don't think that the components that are universal to all of modern day life are where it began, any of them. The most famous one being RNA, the sister language of DNA, because the prevailing paradigm for a very long time has been the RNA world hypothesis, which Luke very accurately summarized as saying, well, it all began with genes. Maybe, but it comes from the assumption, well, it's got to be one of the three, and that kind of it has certain advantages. But it's been very difficult to make RNA prebiotically. RNA has been shown over and again to be better than endless chemical modifications in various ways. It's almost sort of illogical to think it wasn't a product of evolution. And therefore, time spent trying to produce RNA prebiotically is time wasted because we just assumed it had to begin with what we've got today, right?
Right.
So, Steve, do you feel comfortable telling us a little bit about what the first bugs were like? Just in a very broad brush strokes. And then where I'm leading to is these bugs are then spending billions of years coming up with greater and greater genetic complexity. And I'll throw terms out there for you to maybe work with to lead towards. We know now about horizontal gene transmission. We know a lot
Right.
about gene duplication with modification. So maybe talk about those early bugs playing around with gene duplication.
See what I can do there. So I think
Okay.
the most useful way to enter this bit of the conversation is to imagine a line in your mind with a point at each end. And the point on the left, we're going to call the origin of life. And the point on the right, we're going to call Luca, last universal common ancestor, short for last universal common ancestor of all life that we know about today. So that line is, well, first thing is it's a line, it's not a point. There is a lot of something, evolution, happening between the origin of life and Luca. And Luca, we definitely contain DNA, RNA, lipids, proteins, all of it, right? More importantly, we can reconstruct the genome of Luca, the way that you've read about them doing it with woolly mammoths. The computers are powerful enough that within some degree of accuracy, we can figure out that the last universal common ancestor, I think I've got a quote somewhere from a paper that says basically was like a modern bacterium in terms of complexity, in terms of genetic sophistication. It had all the components, had all the genes. It was basically E. coli, but different, you know. And so this is what I mean, that all of the interesting stuff happened in a very short period of time, because we currently would place Luca at about 3.5, probably older, billion years ago, meaning that life originated and got to genes, proteins, lipid membranes, and complex, large genomes, all within that first few 100 million years.
Yeah.
So your question, that just throws it into sharp relief that what were they like is a big question. I'd love to answer it in a frustratingly non-answery way next, but Scott, you wanted to say something.
Oh, well, no, I was just going to say it seems like it's almost a critical mass kind of thing where there's
Possibly.
this all, and to us it's it sounds to me at least like it's kind of a dark age. Like we don't really know much about between that point and Luca, that whole bit in
That's the
there.
exciting place to me because exactly as you say, it's dark and it's exciting. A lot of people have ideas about it, and I think that some of them are wrong-headed, but remembering you're talking to one individual. Yes, everything you've said. Also, just before we go on, let's reflect back that we're saying that if it were a different component and a different language and a Darwinian evolution-like process, but not with the components that we've always associated with Darwinian evolution, that's exactly why it's a dark area. We don't quite know how to ask the question, right?
Yeah,
What else
right.
evolves? What are the rules? How are they different? Those are the questions that interest me. But now let's talk about the idea that I think what I'm challenging myself to do, and it sounds very Zen, but is to try and unthink what life is. Because of the story we've just told, that when we asked, like, well, which came first out of DNA or proteins or membranes, we came up with a bunch of theories and all went to, academic war with each other. Whereas it really might be the answer, none of the above and all of them. And, I want to unthink that there was a bug the way we mean it. Carl Woese was the guy who first learned for the entire scientific community how to sort of define genetic differences in a way that build those beautiful trees we see of life. And he was a proponent of the idea that one of the final things that happened before we got to Luca was the invention of the individual. And that before that, there were sort of temporary agglomerations of genetic material, which when they literally reached critical mass to replicate, they replicated. But there were no individuals, there were no bugs. Now, that's telling you that not because I think it's correct, although I have a lot of sympathy for it, but just to illustrate what it might mean to unthink life. It might be more like viruses. You always hear they aren't alive. Yeah, they don't really have a genome. They hijack your cell to copy the genetic material that literally says, I'm a virus, fine, inject yourself into a cell. And they can't do it without us. But Woe sort of imagines a world that was more like endless viruses, that if you got the right 23 of them together, they achieved replication. That's what a lot of that dark age looked like. And again, all I'm saying is it could and probably did look a lot different, so that we shouldn't be too happy to talk about it too glibly in 2024. Yeah.
Part of where I was going with this question was I was getting at how genetic complexity just built up exponentially. And a lot of people struggle with that. How can you have so much information being generated so quickly? But they're thinking basically, they're limiting their thinking by imagining that a given organism might come up with a new gene and only pass it on to their descendants. But they don't understand this whole idea of horizontal gene transmission where one species can give the gene to another
Yeah.
organism.
Yes.
And all of that genetic complexity is coming out of that was one component that I wanted to talk briefly about. The other one was how do you generate complexity? You take an existing gene, make a copy, a duplicate copy of that gene, and then you start to play
Right.
around with the duplicate copy. And when you get a
Yeah.
nice result, you pass that around to your descendants, but you also pass it around to other organisms around you.
Yeah. Both
So
true.
a few words on that.
One of Wose's big points was the world I just described from him pre-Luca of temporary agglomerations was nothing but lateral transfer. And I think in some of his language in the later papers on this topic, which is now, 20 years ago, he stopped writing about it. But some of his later papers were literally saying that it was sort of the invention of vertical transfer, which is what we think of as how genetic material propagates from father to son. That was an invention that was very late and one of the last things that happened before Luca. Before that, it was nothing but horizontal transfer because it was nothing but genes kind of interacting with each other when they found each other, right? There weren't organisms, there weren't bugs. So I would suggest that those two mechanisms are still very actively studied and that they are illustrative of this sort of larger sphere of evolution for which the theory is not very well defined yet. Do we have a theory of lateral gene transfer in post-Luca evolution? Kind of, yeah. But it's a very narrow one because it's sort of like how does it happen in multicellular organisms? Often viruses are involved. But it doesn't really speak to what are the rules by which we would study how this happened pre-Luca if there were no organisms, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, there's a lot there, but yeah, I mean, you're asking the right questions. Oh, Luke, I've got to say something to everybody listening. Know that this makes me absolute whack job to everybody in the entire community, but I'm convinced that there is no good data suggesting that genetic complexity has increased. Period.
Wow.
Ever.
You'll have to
I think
explain
that's
what you mean
another
by that.
wrong-headed question, but that makes me odd. Okay.
You'll have to explain what you mean by that.
I mean, the first layer of it is no. You'll have to explain to me what you were thinking of because everyone has this hunch that it's obvious. But that's always what science has gone and replaced is hunches that were obvious. What were you thinking of? Human beings don't have a larger genome than any other organism. They don't have more genes than any other organism. We're right slap bang in the middle for eukaryotes, right? And there are lots and lots of layers to this, but really it's a challenge to say define your terms because I think we far too happily accept the assumption that something was going upwards for 4 billion years and we're calling it complexity. And I've yet to see anybody show me it in a way where they can define it, measure it, and I'm like, yep, that makes sense. I think it's not so much that it couldn't go up. It's just that it's the wrong way of looking at it. That's actually a pre-Darwinian evolutionary view. The reason that we recognize Darwin as being the beginning of modern scientific thinking about evolution is he sort of recognized that was the wrong way of looking at it, at least once life has got started. Lamarck and all of the other pre-Darwinians were trying to figure out the mechanism that caused organisms to evolve to become more complex. Darwin didn't say they get simpler or anything. He just said that's the wrong question. It's not about things getting more complex. It's about how they specialize to their environments. And I stand firm saying that's all I believe that I've seen good data to support for genetic evolution. In fact, all of the information that puzzles some people almost deliberately about, well, where does the information come from? It comes from the environment, my friends. That's what Darwin taught us. There's no mystery about where genetic information comes from. It is a weird kind of reflection of the environments over millennia. That's what it is.
Have the two of you seen the movie Contact?
Yes, love it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I think the listeners will have seen that movie as well. But just very briefly, the point I'm coming to here is in that movie, they just hear this signal, an audio signal, but then someone notices there's detail in the audio signal. So they unpack that, which then gives them another layer of information. But then they notice that there's little
Yeah.
symbols that they can overlap, and they could find a third level of information. And it's just unpacking all
Yeah.
these layers of information until finally have the blueprints to build a machine that takes them to the other side of the galaxy. But here's where I'm going with that point. We're understanding more and more about genetics, and now I'm going to speak way out of my area. Steve, maybe you'll correct me on
Yeah.
some of these things. But in epigenetics, we've always been thinking about the genes, the DNA, and where is all this complexity
Yeah.
coming from? You were asking the question, are we really getting more and more complexity? The human genome is not that much bigger than, for example, the primates, let alone.
Look, it's smaller than many
Right.
eukaryotic genomes of things that your intuition would tell you are simpler than you are.
Yeah, but here's where I'm going. Layers of information. That movie Contact, they found that once they learned one thing, they found there's a whole new layer of information buried in there, and then another one buried in that. So in genetics, we've always been focusing on the DNA and the genes, but now we're beginning to understand there's a whole other layer of genetics. It's the microRNAs that
Absolutely.
they don't code for genes themselves, but they're turning on this gene and that gene, and now I want this gene to come
Yeah.
up 3 times, and I'm going to turn off gene number 4. But now we want they orchestrate the production and the turning off of different proteins. And so when you compare a primate's, a monkey's DNA to a human's, they're really not that much different at all. We always hear about they're 99% similar. But when you look at all those microRNAs, tiny little RNAs that are sequentially turning genes on and off at the right times to produce an entirely different organism, either human or a chimpanzee, a whole new layer of information in there. And who knows what other layers we're going to find out in 20 years.
Absolutely. But I want to contrast the idea that that has somehow been being added over time with the idea that it's equally possible that what we're looking at over a 4 billion year time span of biological evolution is ever more refinement of a heterogeneous system into a really sort of sorry, I'm mixing words here. Let me start out from a different direction. If I took lemon juice and distilled it down, boiled off all the water, have I made it more complex? I
No?
think it's more like that, what you're talking about with
Okay.
evolution. So I think we've brought in-house into the cell, into evolution, into microRNAs over time, more and more powerful ways of doing what used to be messy and joyful and heterogeneous and involving minerals and proteins and all of that stuff, right? Now, if you want to call that complexity, great, but I just want to be quite clear that when we hear that word, that would be yet another meaning of the word. Great. Let's get about measuring that then. Sure. Okay. But I think evolution has distilled information, not created it, which is a very big point because so many of our colleagues who have a problem with evolution would say, well, my problem is it defies entropy, it defies thermodynamics to create it. Life does not create information. If I say one thing that I'm absolutely confident about, it's that. That's what Darwin taught us over 200 years ago. Life encodes the information that is in the environment. Life is a response to an environment. Why do cactuses, where do they get the information to have spines from? From an incredibly dry environment where resource water is so precious that you're better off making your leaves into spines. They left behind more offspring. They didn't create an idea, they reflected an environment, and that's all that life's been doing. It's distilling the universe into a weird coded language called DNA, since Luca at least, right?
This is starting to sound like Simon Conway Morris.
Well, we are friends. I would at least ask him. I think we're friends.
We're going to speak to him next week, but what you're saying now is really reminding me of what he's talking about.
Yes. And so it's sort of odd, but a meta theme for me, and I don't mean to be dismissive of the real questions you want answered, but is don't get hung up on the details. It's a fascinating and beautiful story to understand how nuclear fusion produces carbon and oxygen and nitrogen, how those form into amino acids, how all of that's good. But what's really underlying it is a much more general theme here that life is part of the universe. It's inescapably part of the universe, and it's sort of gonna happen that pockets of the universe distill other bits of the universe. We call that life, right?
So it sounds like you're beginning to answer a question. We're getting long on time, and I thought maybe we should go to listeners' questions. And it sounds like you're getting close to a question that one of our listeners asked. It was Christine. She was asking us. We just spent a number of weeks talking about fine-tuning of the universe, all these physicists talking about the universe being fine-tuned, and she was asking, why do we always just talk about fine-tuning in the context of the universe and astrophysics?
Good.
She wondered if even things like life and evolution and biology can be finely tuned. And I think the answer might be
Good.
yes. I'll let you answer, but where I'm wondering where the answer might be yes is when we look at the genetic machinery, the coding and decoding machinery, it needs to be so robust to maintain the genes, the code, to make sure that there's no errors. So it's got to be very, very strictly, very accurate. But on the other hand, it needs to be loose enough that some new ideas,
Yeah.
new genetic codings can come in there to give us diversity. So Stephen, is genetics and biology and evolution, can they also be finely tuned?
So, excellent question. Well done, Christine. Really hot area. Now, I will say honestly that a book, the only time I've ever worked on a book with Simon Conway Morris was about 20 years ago and was trying to get at that exact question to show what a good question it was.
Hmm.
And that was the John Templeton Foundation saying, look, we've got quite an increasingly well-established argument for fine-tuning in physics. How does it and how does it apply as we move through chemistry into biology? Yeah, nobody's ever read the book and it's way too expensive and it's an academic one of those, right? But the point is, we didn't have any clear answers, but I think the question stands. It's a brilliant question. And I loved being a part of that because all the voices in it, including Simon Conway Morris, had angles. But we're all admitting this is a really good question and we've just got an approach or an idea or a fraction. And that's the space I love living in scientifically. Christine, keep asking that question. Just two sort of words of warning as either viewers or YouTube podcasters might go further with it. One of the much more sort of cynical reasons why it doesn't get talked about in biology is it did a lot. And it's called intelligent design, not just in this modern form, but pre-Darwinian. This is Paley's watchmaker argument, is that the exquisite fine-tuning of biology proves the existence of God. So, for wrong reasons, a similar sounding question has got a bad rap in evolution. So we need to overcome that and understand that there is a different level at which we're asking it now. There are subfields, and we make them sound very dry, but they're all hot if Christine or you want to look at them. But evolution of mutation rate, the evolution of evolution, the evolution of evolvability. You'll find papers on all of these themes that are really talking to what Christine is asking. My work has much more materially done some of this, measuring the code as being very resistant to mutation, but allowing some play. Our work with proteins now is looking if we changed all the building blocks, what else changes and what stays the same. So we're all probing at that exact question. So again, just good question, Christine, right?
Okay.
Do you mind if sorry,
And
there's
you've
one more
already-
thing I want to say that from this, one of the things I think I discovered from the workshop that led to that book was we do see it differently. And I'm not saying it's about right and wrong, but I want to give you a different view of what the astrophysicists see. And this is more like a biologist's view. I wonder if it isn't the case that a different set of fundamental parameters for the universe that gave us a different universe, maybe without atoms as we know them, but with whatever the world would be in high energy plasma with different physics, right? Whether life wouldn't then be unstoppable. It's sort of the way I think about it, rather than, oh, great, they've finally given us what we need to account for life, right? Does that make sense? There's a subtly different way of looking at it. They're looking at it physics forwards, and I'm looking at it biology backwards, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you might have redeemed me, Stephen, because I made a proposal in our introductory, or maybe it was the second episode that we did. I suggested that life can take all kinds of different
Yeah.
forms. I said we could have life forms that don't have physical bodies and work with
Yes.
magnetism.
Yes, all of that's possible.
Right.
Scientifically, there could be different life around us that we don't know how to recognize it
Yes.
yet, right? Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you
Yes.
for giving me some validation there. One other question, and actually, this is another listener who asked three separate questions, and you've already answered most of them.
Okay.
He asked very briefly. This is Nick's questions. He asked about panspermia, Earth's early chemistry. He wants to know some evidence that supports the transition from simple to complex molecules. So we've already talked about those. His
Okay.
third question, you gave a bit of an answer to Christine's. He asks here, what are some of the most promising interdisciplinary projects that audience members can keep track
Oh, good
of if we're
question.
interested in this whole field?
Look, in terms of the three components you mentioned, they are still alive and well. It's just there's more pluralism than I'm used to seeing. But I would say that definitely look at the membrane people who are asking the question. Look, they really excite me right now. But secondly, look at the chemical evolution people as an example of this. Hey, wait a minute, Darwinian stuff. It doesn't need to all be genes and the rules we've learned, right? Those might be two areas that I really encourage you to look at. And inescapably, certainly in the second group, the mineral people. Again, moving things that we're like, well, you need life to do that. No, you don't. And they're beginning to sort of wonder how we do that with, yeah. Those might be my top tips.
Okay, so I think we should wrap things up. The main message again, Steve, that I wanted to get from you was just this whole idea of how this fine-tuned universe producing a universe full of planets and stars and the periodic table. And then as soon as this Earth appeared, almost in a blink of an eye, we have this life appearing as if it was pre-programmed. Does this give you any reason to think about meaning and purpose? Should our listeners take from this some ideas about meaning and purpose?
I mean, wonderful question. I personally live in a space now. I'm probably more postmodern in the sense that I think each of us constructs our own meaning out of those facts. There are certain ways that we can look at them that to me seem like, well, it kind of hints at this, doesn't it? And let's face it, I think I would say the life-affirming nature of our universe makes me feel that it is at least consistent with a loving creator. But I think that we live in an age where even fine-tuning, it's for each person to construct meaning from what they see there. Because remember, I've just argued that it might turn out that one day, maybe if we discover other ways of doing life, pure energy, no matter involved, would sort of begin to hint at if the physics parameters have been different, maybe it's still life, right? There will be, that's perhaps the most affirming thing scientifically, is that within my brief span, I've watched unanswerable questions become tractable and then get answered. So hang in there, right? And it's a fascinating adventure, and the life-affirming nature of our universe, or at the very least of our planet, I find really encouraging. Certainly, let's finish there then to say that I think the evidence is patchy and weakening for this idea that we're just a meaningless dot at the edge of a meaningless galaxy amongst infinite where things got lucky. Nothing fits that, really.
Great words to end off on, Stephen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for a great podcast series, great questions, really good stuff.
And thank you for giving us your time. It's late in the day for you. I know that you've had a number of big administrative meetings, and yet you've kept to your promise to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
Hey, this was my highlight of my day. Thank you.
And we will talk again. Thanks so much, Steve.
I love working with you guys. Anytime you want to talk to me, I'm yours. All right.
Well, thank you.
More power to you and the podcast. Take care.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye now. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.